Chelsea Kim, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for having me.
We will start with a short interview. First, tell us where you're from.
So I was born in South Korea, Seoul, and I've lived around a lot of places, but I've lived in Vancouver and British Columbia, and then my family also lived in the South, in Mississippi and Alabama for a few years, and now we're in Massachusetts, but currently I live in Baltimore.
And how old were you when you started to study music?
I apparently was a little less than 4 years old. And how I started was my family went to a church service in Korea, and they were having a little student recital. And I saw a girl who's just a few years older than me who was dressed in a pretty white dress, and she was giving a violin recital. And as soon as we came back home, apparently I told my parents, I want to do that. And I was a very rambunctious child, so they didn't initially trust me with the real violin. So they bought me a toy violin. And later on, I figured out I really couldn't do anything because it was playing the notes for me. So I threw or hid my fake violin, the toy violin, and asked for a real one. And I continued to take lessons, but it didn't really become a big part of my life until we moved to Canada. And I studied with my teacher there, Mr. Kapok, and he encouraged me to play in public a lot. I was just putting on a lot of recitals. So this was when I was like probably from 7 to 12 or 13. And he encouraged me to do small competitions around. And then none of us realized that I was actually good at music until I started winning some of these little competitions. After I came to Canada is when music became a very big part of my life.
And so you chose violin because you were enamored with the beautiful girl playing violin. Do you play any other instrument?
Yeah, so my parents started me also with piano when I was 6 because they thought that would help with my pitch training to learn the violin. So I did that. And then I also played clarinet in marching band when I was in the South, only for 2 years.
So tell me, when was it that you decided that you wanted to be a professional musician?
I went to Phillips Exeter for high school, which is a rigorously academic boarding school. And there, I had to travel every weekend from New Hampshire to Boston to take lessons with Donald Weilerstein at NEC Preparatory School. But I realized I was looking forward to that every weekend. That's when I started, oh, maybe this is something I want to do for my life. And I think I went to a lot of festivals when I was a student, which helped me a lot in deciding what I wanted to do. If I hadn't done those festivals, I also wouldn't have known until maybe way, way later if I really wanted to do violin. But being in that environment and surrounded with colleagues who are so talented and mentors who are just so supportive and passionate about your talent and your music, that really encouraged me to pursue this field. So I think that's in high school is when I decided I really want to do music.
So you went to this boarding high school. Did they not have a music program there?
They did. They definitely did. They had a great music program, actually, a lot of orchestra and chamber. But because it's an academically driven school, music was definitely not the forte. And so for me, I was only going to NEC Prep because I was still undecided what I wanted to do, if I wanted to pursue academics or music. But I think by the end of my junior and senior year, I realized music is what I wanted to do. So that's why I was doing those trips every weekend.
So after high school and after doing music festivals and studying in New England, where did you go to study?
I went to Juilliard for my bachelor's after high school. I chose Juilliard first because my teacher, Leland, and also second because I wanted to see the big city and be surrounded with all different kinds of people. And I think I made a great choice. New York is a tough life. It's especially if you're not used to the big city life. But what I enjoy most about being in New York is the diversity. And I seeked out any kind of gig opportunities, chamber opportunities, and that's so easy because there's so many people there who are willing to do a lot of stuff in New York. And being in New York made me realize I love violin because I can play and collaborate with other people.
And Juilliard is known for all kinds of arts, not just music. So did you get to collaborate with dancers and singers and actors and things like that while you were there?
Yes, I did. I was in this one production with a dancer friend. She organized her group of dancers and she choreographed the dance herself, and then a group of musicians who would play with the music. And she also had a composer friend who wrote the music for her. So it was just such an interesting and just beautiful collaboration of all different sorts of arts coming together. We had to wear really funky outfits, imitating clowns. So it was kind of like a very festive, like fun piece. Yeah, I love those kind of different arts coming together, and Juilliard was a great place to explore that.
And so for your undergrad, you went to Juilliard, but for your master's, you went to Rice. So tell us a little bit
Yeah,
about.
yeah, and Juilliard, I was more busy in exploring the possibilities that I could have with music, and I only came to a decision to pursue orchestra music when you've also been there, Alex, Music Academy of the West. I went there. My first year was sophomore year of Juilliard, and I went there for 3 years, and that was a place where I met my teacher at Rice, Miss Kathleen Winkler, and she was just a huge inspiration for me. She's just a wonderful lady, and I learned so much about practicing excerpts, preparing for orchestra auditions, being in an orchestra, and learning how to play as a section. Like those things, not every conservatory or every teacher teaches that. So that's what I was seeking, and I learned so much through her and the program there, and that's where I decided I needed to orchestra. So I sought out Miss Winkler because she's one of the best.
So now you're with the Baltimore Symphony. So tell us how long you've been with Baltimore and what your job is like there.
So I started officially in May 2019. I came to Baltimore as a section of the second violins. Recently, I just took another internal audition. I got moved up to the first. I love this orchestra. This orchestra, I am so honored that this is my first orchestra, and hopefully, I will stay here. It's one of the most phenomenal orchestras I've really heard and played with, because what makes an orchestra so special is the sound, of course, but also how well and how flexible the players are to each other. And my experience with the Baltimore Symphony has been nothing but, it's been a very big learning experience for me. And I'm just proud of this orchestra, and I can't wait to see what more this orchestra can do. So I'm really honored to be in part of this.
Great. So let's go ahead and you can give your presentation.
Okay, great. I would like to take this time to talk generally about the string instruments in the symphonic orchestra. I'll touch base with what they are and what roles they serve, what they look like, what kind of sounds they make, and importantly, how they fit into the orchestra. And then I will talk about how these string instruments come together, what is needed to make perfect ensemble playing. And lastly, I'll cover some few techniques used by string instruments in orchestra that is very unique for strings. So in a symphonic orchestra, the string instruments are right here in the purple. They surround the conductor and are seated closest to the audience. This placement guarantees that the strings are heard against the louder percussion and brass instruments, who are placed further back in here, which allows the sections to play together with fluidity and communication. The string family of an orchestra consists of the 4 string wooden instruments seen on this slide. Starting from the left to right, there is the violin here, viola, cello, and the double bass. All 4 of these differ in size, timbre, and range, and each with a specific role. The violin is the smallest and can play the highest range, and the double bass is the biggest and can play the lowest. As you can see, the violin and the viola are slightly different from the cello and the double bass. The violin and the viola have a chin rest, as you can see right here underneath their tailpiece. This supports the musicians to tuck their instruments under their chin. The cello and the double bass, which is not shown here, but I will show later in the next slides, have a long metal rod right here on the bottom called the end pins. And this can be held in place by a rubber stopper to support the instrument standing up on the ground. So how cellists would usually play is they tuck their instruments between their legs and they're in sitting position. And the end pin supported by the rubber stopper is set firm onto the ground. And then bass players sit on a stool because the bass is so big, or stand while playing their instruments. So for string instruments, there are 5 key features that are common and necessary to these instruments' functions: the scroll, the pegs, the fingerboard, the F-hole, and the bridge. The scroll is right here, this squirrely head up here, and it is actually called the head of the instrument. And if you see these 4 pegs here, 2 on each side, these are turned to loosen and tighten the strings, to tune the strings. And the fingerboard is the black board all the way down the violin. And this is where fingers are placed to make the different notes. And then on the other side of the violin, you see here is the bridge. And the bridge's purpose is to transmit the strings' vibrations to the body of the instrument. Even the slightest change in height or the placement of the bridge can dramatically change the color and the tone of the violin. It's very, very sensitive. Even like the slightest millimeter shaven off from the wood of the bridge can really affect the tone and the sound and the projection of the violin. And last is the F-holes right here on the side of the violins. There's 2. And these F-holes are so called because it looks like a lowercase f. These are what makes the sound that the bridge transmits into the body of the violin, and it echoes throughout, and it sends out that sound into the air. So that's why for all string instruments, the prime location to draw out the most beautiful, vibrant sound is right over the F-holes. So right in the middle between the bridge here and the fingerboard. The other essential equipment we need for string players is the bow. This is a tensioned wooden rod with horsetail hairs, thousands of horsetail hairs drawn from the frog to the tip. And the tension of the hairs is kept loose or taut by the screw at the frog of the bow, which you see at the very end here. And the friction of thousands of these horse hairs drawn across the instrument strings is what produces the sound. It is required for all string musicians to have absolute control and proficiency of the bow to create the different kinds of tones and articulations needed in every piece. So this is a lot of bows. And I only want you to focus on the first bow and the last bow. So the first bow is actually called the Baroque bow. Baroque bows are used when sometimes orchestras perform historical pieces or pieces written in the Baroque era, and we try to imitate as close as we can to the sounds made on the instruments back in the 1600s. Violins might be a little bit more expensive and difficult to change, but bows, we can try to use Baroque bows to imitate the sound. So the Baroque bow, unlike the modern bow, is quite light, and it's much shorter in length, as you can see. And this, it's called the swanbill pointed tip right here, which is very different from the denser tip of the modern bow, is what creates the very light, springy sound. Because it is so light, it is hard to make a forte sound. And another difference is that the Baroque bow was held with the thumb under the frog, under the hairs. So you would be kind of grasping the bow with your whole hand, like a bass player holds it. And the modern bow, we don't hold it like that anymore. But this hold also allowed for string musicians to play with a light dance feel, which was a lot of the music in the 1600s. However, in the 18th and 19th century, classical and romantic composers started to write longer notes and heavier texture. And this tiny Baroque bow just is not made to sustain notes or force more weight. And thus, the modern bow was developed. So now that we've had a basic introduction to the string family, I'm going to talk briefly about each instrument, and starting with mine, the violin. So the violin is the smallest instrument of the strings, and we can play the highest up to E7. This range comes in very handy for producing ethereal or shrilly sound effects. Because of the instrument's expressive sound and ability to play many fast notes, violins are most often given the melody in an orchestra. The violins are the only section you'll find that have two groups within. We have the first violins and the second violins. The two are no less or greater than the other because both are equally necessary to create a beautiful unified sound. The first violins generally sing the melody lines, often an octave higher than the seconds. Their job is to make sure that they're able to project the beautiful melody, and they have to maintain the character and the metronomic steadiness at the same time. As one of the most recurring soloists of the orchestra, it is our job to know all the notes, keep our eyes on the conductor, and ears open to the whole orchestra at all times. I will show you now an excerpt from the Rachmaninoff Symphony No. 2, third movement. This is one of my favorite pieces since I was in high school because it is just, I mean, whoever hears this piece cannot just be awestruck at the beauty and the purity of this music. And in this excerpt, you'll hear in the third movement, the first violins take the original melody that was actually the clarinets. And clarinet has a more mellow, soothing sound tone that starts off very beautiful and peaceful. And once the violins take it, it is a whole different picture with it on a higher octave with more intensity, more passion. So here is the clip. I wanted to show you actually another example of how virtuosic a violinist can be in orchestra music and how much of an agile technique is needed for pieces like this. So this excerpt is from Schumann Symphony No. 2, second movement, very infamous excerpt for violins. And you can hear how the sonic speed of the violin's tunes accelerates and drives the energy for that fantastic finale of this movement. Wow, what a blast. I think those notes, the amount of notes that violinists can play, it really is a unique skill. And that just sets up a huge momentum for the whole piece. So while the first violins play away at notes, the second violins serve as the important backbones that help first violins shine bright in their spotlight. Second violins usually play some of the melodies one octave lower than the first, and will be given passages that are harmonically and rhythmically supportive to the first. And the first violins depend strongly on the seconds to be firm on pitch and rhythm. So it is absolutely important that the seconds are in sync with the rest of the string sections. Having two sections of violinists also created opportunities to explore the orchestra setup. Most of you are familiar with the traditional layout, which has the strings going from high to low range, left to right. This became the norm only less than 100 years ago, created by the music director of Philadelphia Orchestra, Leopold Stokowski. This has become the widely accepted layout, mostly because it is just easier to coordinate bowings and rhythms, and visually looks better to have the two violin sections sit next to each other. But in this picture, as you can see, this is the layout that existed 100 years ago before Stokowski. And this is a layout which actually a lot of European orchestras still use and has the second violins opposite from the first. This layout is often used when playing pieces by composers such as Mozart, Elgar, and Mahler, who wrote antiphonal, which means conversational effect in the strings. So this next excerpt is this is the Mozart Symphony number 41 called the Jupiter, last movement. And this is such a fun piece. And what happens is there are dialogues everywhere. It's a fugue. You will hear, especially in the first and seconds, this passage that I chose, there's a distinct conversation going on. First violins start with a phrase, a sentence, and then the second violins will answer the same exact phrase, but in a little bit twisted or in a different key with different notes. And then they have this conversation back and forth, back and forth. And just visually too, seeing the two interact with each other, and in a concert hall when you're sitting in the audience, it just makes the performance even better. So take a look at this. So there is just this beautiful harmony, and as artists, being visually professional is also very important for us orchestra musicians. And that's a very good example to see how those two sections interact. And now I'm going to talk about a very important role in the orchestra, which is the concertmaster. Concertmaster is one of the first violins, and they are seated at the first seat right next to the conductor. So he or she is the one who gives the tuning A. The concertmaster, as a leader of the orchestra, his or her job is to make decisions regarding bowing and other technical and musical details, which is key in developing a cohesive sound within the section. So the concertmaster must know not just his or her own parts, but the whole score, just like a conductor would, so that he or she is ready to lead in the violin section at the right times. Therefore, the concertmaster serves as a conduit and a spokesperson between the conductor and the strings, and essentially the whole orchestra. And concertmasters are also responsible for the violin solos and orchestra pieces. And this is a chance for them to showcase their artistry and interpretation of the music. In 2018, I attended a festival in Santa Barbara called Music Academy of the West. And that's where Alex went too. We're both alumni of Music Academy. And I had the utmost privilege of performing Vaughan Williams' Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis, which is a string orchestra piece and features principals of each section. So the concertmaster of the first violins, principal of the second violins, principal of the violas, and principal of the cellos are featured with a lot of solos. And it's just this pristine, beautiful English piece. And there's this one part where the violin and the viola has a duet, and then the orchestra comes in, and it's just such a magical moment. And I would love to share that with you. All right, so that's enough said about violins. So next we're on to the violas. The viola is a little bit bigger and wider than the violin and has the strings C, G, D, and A. And the range for the viola is a lot lower as they read an alto clef. And composers love using the viola for the mellow, richer sound that the violin lacks. In this next clip, this is the Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra fourth movement, and there is a beautiful melody that the violas sing. And you can hear the warmer and richer timbre of the viola is actually just perfect for this somber melody, as opposed to how it could have sounded on a violin or a bass. And this one more clip I wanted to show is a viola solo from the Romeo and Juliet Suite Number 2 by Prokofiev. And I think that this solo is just amazing in that it just accentuates the incredible range that the viola has. And a lot of people don't realize the huge range, but actually it has an incredible range. And that's why the violas can freely change from being expressive to being supportive to fill in the harmonies between the cello and the violins. Yeah, if you hear, just it's really unthinkable how beautifully and smoothly the viola can change in range and in volume. And so the next instrument is the cello. The cello, as you can see, is much bigger and wider than the violin or viola. It uses the same strings as the viola, but the strings are thicker and their range is an octave lower. Cellists read off bass and tenor clefs, and they are known for their extremely deep and resonant sound. Composers often write counter melodies for cellos with the violin's melody or vice versa. This next piece is another of my favorite pieces from Symphony Number 4, second movement. In this variation, you will hear how the cello starts off with a melody line and is so delicately supported by the violin's counter melody. And last but not least is the double bass. The double bass stands as tall as an average man, and it uses strings E, A, D, and G, and has the lowest range out of all the string instruments. Because the bass is so big, it is impossible to play as fast and as many notes as the violin because the spacing between the fingers is probably 5 times larger than the spacings for a violin. However, because of its powerful projection due to its size, the basses are the major foundation for the rest of the strings. So here I got a capture of an excerpt from Rossini's Overture to William Tell. And one would look at this excerpt and think, huh, okay, two notes, E and B, and pretty simple repetitive rhythm. That seems pretty easy, but this is actually one of the most crucial excerpts for bass players, as the E and the B are the tonic and the dominant, and therefore are the most important notes. Everyone in the orchestra, especially the strings, are counting on the basses to be super in tune. And this rhythm is repetitive with the same notes, but it is the core foundation of this piece's rhythm. So because the bass projects so well, we strings try to focus our sound and our intonation towards the bass, because the bass is the central anchors of the strings. So you can hear how chaotic this piece would actually be if we didn't have not just basses, but basses are one of the instruments that keep the foundation strong in this piece. Yeah, so next time you see an easy excerpt, just think twice. And this is actually because we didn't really get to hear how the bass sounds in the previous excerpt. This is a short piece by Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals, The Elephant. So that brings an end to the overview of all the instruments. And now I'm going to talk really quickly about the most important thing of playing in an orchestra is ensemble skills. Because each instrument is so different in terms of sound and range, it is extremely important to know as an orchestra musician how to listen to others around you, to match sounds and be attentive and react at all times to your colleagues. No amount of practice and rehearsals can guarantee that at the time of the concert, something different can happen than what was rehearsed. And as a professional musician, you are trained to react right on the spot in an appropriate manner to save your music. So for strings, there are three things that we must match to create a united sound within our sections. Vibrato is a trait that is very personal to us string players, like how singers use vibrato. It's totally subjective on how we use it to emphasize a note or elongate a phrase. Different speed and the width of the vibrato can change the intonation and interpretation. The second thing is matching the part of the bow is really important as to how visually, professionally it looks, and also to strive to produce the same articulation and volume as your colleagues. And lastly, if the vibrato and the part of the bow are in sync with the rest of the section, it is important to play with the same style as your colleagues. So for example, one would not play a piece by Strauss the same way one would play a Mozart piece. And most of these musical decisions are made by the conductor and the principals of each section, but they depend greatly on the rest of the musicians, us, to agree on a musical idea and strive to fit each other's sound to that idea. So these are only a few of the many aspects that orchestra musicians must be aware of and know how to control. These just show how much detailed attention is required of all the musicians. So as you have seen so far, the string instruments have an amazing range of styles, techniques, and sounds. And there are also techniques that are unique to string instruments in orchestral pieces to produce certain effects or to set a mood instead of dominating the melody lines all the time. For those who play or plan to play in an orchestra, these terms are crucial just to know because they show up in orchestra literature everywhere. But I will just cover four and explain to you what they are, how they're done, and what effects they have in the orchestra. So first one we'll go, I'll talk briefly about the tremolo. So tremolo comes from the Latin word tremulus, which literally means to tremble. It's just a rapid reiteration of a note or two, and it makes the sound like a tremble or a quiver. And you can see right here on the diagram to the left, the second row and the third row is how it is written, with 2 or 3 lines on the stems of the note. But the first line of the diagram, you see, that's literally how it is played, just notes repeated. And on the right, you see this diagram is representative of the tremolo happening between 2 notes. So it would be hi, 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 instead of ha, 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 ha. So there's a difference in that. And using tremolos can create, if you use it in a pianissimo setting, it can sound very bright and shimmery. Or in a forte setting, it can sound very ominous and tense and foreboding. Tremolos also serve to dictate the speed and direction of the music. For example, in the next excerpt I'll show you, this is the Beethoven's 7th Symphony. Beethoven uses ascending and descending tremolo lines in the violins to create a rhythmic energy that lands the orchestra on a dominant 7th. So there was a huge buildup, and the tremolo was used as an effect to even intensify that buildup. Let's take a look at it. The next technique this is not as commonly seen, but this is the repeated down bows. Literally is just a series of repeated down bows in a circular motion. In his ballet Rite of Spring, Stravinsky incorporates a lot of repeated down bows for all the strings with accents on sporadic beats to create a visually and harmonically jarring sensation of the young girl's sacrificial dance. Especially because this was a ballet, seeing that whole row of strings just all mechanically doing down bows, I could imagine it must have been a very jarring and even creepier experience to have seen. So here's a clip of this. It's a short clip, but you can see how the gravity of the down bows, the repeated down bows, although it is very hard and very tiring, the gravity of it puts even more force and weight that we try to force it on our own. So it's a great technique. The third technique is called the colegno. Colegno is a technique which involves hitting the wooden back of your bow onto the strings. So this creates a very percussive sound with the faintest hint of a pitch of the finger note, but this does not allow the sound to ring. So in this next excerpt, composer Berlioz used this technique for the violins and violas in his Symphonie Fantastique. And in this section, he is trying to imitate the eerie sounds of witches cackling and dancing around. And that's why the colegno for this is a great effect and really paints out the visual imagery of the witches and the bones shattering around everywhere. You see how gruesome and grotesque the sound is? Almost like you would never expect string instruments to make that sound. But I think that's a very powerful effect that violins have. And last technique I want to share is the natural harmonics. Harmonics, if I were to very briefly explain it, are overtones that are covered when the finger is pressed firmly on the string. So when the finger is placed softly enough on the string in one of those harmonic stops, then the string vibrates to allow us to hear the hidden overtones. Harmonics are generally softer in volume than normal and sounds light and ethereal. So composers like to use this technique for strings when they want an atmospheric texture. In this last excerpt of my presentation, Mahler begins his first symphony with all the strings starting pianissimo, holding long natural harmonics. And it creates this perfect, mysterious, shimmery effect for the winds to float above with their solos. That's it. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.
Perfect. That was great.
Thank you for listening.
Did you want to say anything on behalf of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra?
Well, on behalf of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, I'm very honored to have been here and spend this time with you guys. We are so desperately looking forward to playing music for everyone again. And yeah, just don't lose hope in music. That is what really brings us together. And we will come back with more music.
This is the Virtual Masterclass Series.
The videos are being released on the Planning Logic website on YouTube, and you can follow also the event announcements on Planning Logic on Facebook. We also have a Spotify page where I've been making playlists from the clinicians. And on the Planning Logic webpage, I've made a resource page that has the playlist, also has recommended resources from the clinicians, links to the clinicians' recordings, and also to their web pages for those that have them. So you can follow all of that on Facebook at Planning Logic Studio, or you can go to the Planning Logic Studio webpage for all that information. Thank you so much, Chelsea.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.